In the history of humanity, there is no one object that is sought after more than that of the Ark of the Covenant, being the chest that God delivered the Ten Commandments in. The biblical significance of the Covenant is as legendary as the myths behind it. From people believing it to contain magical powers, to others believing it to have the keys to the entire universe, there is no shortage of folklore surrounding the artifact. However, most contemporary archaeologists agree that it's most likely just a legend of the Hebrew Bible, and not an actual real-life object. Though the Ark of the Covenant may not exist, the world of gaming sure has a lot of its own lost arks. Whether you refer to them as lost arks, holy grails, or simply just lost media, video games have their own amount of media that has been lost to the sands of time. Whether it be prototypes of some of the most important games in history, to cancelled games that never saw the light of day, or obscure games that only a handful of people have ever played. Though the world of gaming doesn't have as poor of a track record with preservation as that of literature or cinema, there are still bits and pieces that haven't been found yet. In recent years though, several projects have been recovered, restored, and are now fully playable today, one of which was a game that I've previously covered on this channel. In my video, This Game Was Lost for 20 Years, I went over the history of Garage Bad Dream Adventure, a Japanese point-and-click adventure game that, because of its publisher's closure, led to the game being printed in very limited quantities, with it being lost until 4chan users recovered it in the early 2010s. At the end of the video, though I celebrated the recovery of Garage, I also highlighted another Japanese point-and-click adventure game that was still lost. A year and 23 days since I've posted that video on Garage, the game I highlighted at the end of that video was just found. This is the story of the 1995 game Noah's Ark, or as I like to call it, the Lost Ark of Gaming, and how it was found. Also, before I get any comments, I of course know that Noah's Ark and the Ark of the Covenant are two completely separate biblical references. I was raised Catholic, I know.
Be a good Catholic for 15 fucking minutes, is that so much to ask?
But I wanted a good title and an intro that would draw you into the video, and I couldn't really think of anything else, so this is the best I got. In the 80s and 90s, the Nippon Electric Company, also known as NEC, dominated the realms of personal computing in Japan, not only for work and business purposes, but also those used for playing video games. Their PC-88 and their PC-98 lines of personal computers are well remembered for introducing the Japanese to the possibilities of PC gaming, and their own gaming console, the PC Engine, was also very successful, well, at least in Japan. But aside from producing their famous hardware, NEC also dabbled in creating and publishing software as well, with some of these games being created for their competitors' hardware. By the mid-90s, it was clear that Microsoft and Apple would be dominant in the personal computing space for the rest of time, as the innovative Windows and Mac OS would revolutionize the personal computing format as we know it today. In my Garage video, I went over how many of the experimental Japanese point-and-click titles were exclusively released for either Mac OS 7 and above or Windows 3.1 and above. During this time, NEC had several game publishers under its wing, most notably that of NEC Interchannel, which produced some pretty experimental projects at the time, including that of Noah's Ark. But like Garage Bad Dream Adventure and its developer Tomomi Sakaba, Noah's Ark came from a creative visionary outside of the world of gaming. The game was created by Kenichi Shigeto, also going by his stage name Ken1, who was one-fourth of the Japanese rock and pop band Date of Birth. Along with helping out with the music, he was also in charge of the visual direction for their band image. Most notably, he designed their mascot Dabkun, who can be seen on many of their album and single covers. As video games, especially those in the point-and-click genre, were becoming more story-based and experimental, like Tomomi Sakaba and Osamu Sato before him, Ken1 most likely saw gaming as not just an avenue to have fun, but a medium that can tell a unique story and have a distinct visual art style. In 1994, Ken1 would work on a game called Insector War, in which he specifically helped developer Riverhill Software with designing the CGI characters and cutscenes present in the game. The game was a first-person maze-like game similar to Faceball 2000, and featured the Dabkun character that would later be present on many of Date of Birth's following record covers. The game was only released in Japan on the Panasonic 3DO, a console, though it had some buzz for its CD-ROM technology, was both a critical and commercial failure in both Japan and the rest of the world. This game, however, is not lost today, and for a Japanese 3DO game, it's not that pricey or rare either. Regardless of the success of Insector War, it was Ken 1's introduction to entering the field of making video games, with his next game being Noah's Ark. Given how the game itself was just found, there isn't any insights on the development of the game, Ken 1's vision, or anything like that, but we do for a fact know that it was published by NEC Interchannel, and that it was developed by a company named Pro4 System. Very little is known about this developer, as the only other game linked to their company is a point-and-click adventure wrestling game called Wrestle Life, which was also released around the same time and was also published by NEC Interchannel. Two things that we do know about the development of Noah's Ark is that it was made via Macromedia, a tool that birthed many Japanese point-and-click adventure games like Garage, and was basically an early version of Flash before Adobe bought it, and that the game's soundtrack was done by a man named Kazuhiro Nishimatsu. He started off making city pop music in the early 80s, but since then had transitioned into making music for television and video games. When it was released on October 5th, 1995, Noah's Ark didn't really have a huge splash within the world of gaming. It had some advertisements in game magazines, but aside from that, we can't really gauge the success of Noah's Ark. And unlike Garage, there's no definitive reason for why it became so obscure. After the release of Noah's Ark, Ken 1 would continue to be in the music and game industry throughout both the late 90s and early 2000s, with his most notable work in the realms of gaming being a director on the PS1 game Planet Daub. Like Garage Bad Dream Adventure, the search for Noah's Ark started on 4chan, but not on the Retro Games board. Instead, it was started on 4chan's Paranormal board, or X for short. The board is a discussion place for those to talk about the occult and conspiracy theories, but today it's mostly known for people creating totally legit guides on how to summon a succubus GF. Anyways, in 2021, a user on the Paranormal board would share a mid-90s website advertising a game called Noah's Ark. He provided both the links for the Japanese version and the English version of the site. Both sites provide the original box, the original price, screenshots, insights on the gameplay, Ken 1 and Nishimatsu's involvement with development, and a plot synopsis which reads as such.
A giant tower suddenly appeared as mankind was working on a project to immigrate to Mars. The mystery of the genesis of man is beyond mere human comprehension as concealed inside. The story takes place in the year 2100. Mankind, which is teetering on the brink of destruction because of a devastated environment and a population explosion, is terraforming Mars to prepare it for immigration. However, just before the base plant is completed, an enormous tower appears from deep underground. An investigation indicates that the tower, which appears to have 7 floors, was constructed some 5 billion years ago. Who was it that left this tower, and why? To solve the mystery, you, the researcher, must enter the tower. Will Mars become the new Noah's Ark for mankind?
A couple months after this was posted to 4chan's Paranormal board, a thread started on the Lost Media Wiki forums on July 15th by user Tusaki368, who had seen the original X thread. That same day, another user named Peachy Keen managed to find a Yahoo Auctions Japan listing for the game complete in box, though the listing was already closed, with Tusaki regretting not purchasing it sooner. With no other options, Tusaki actually managed to contact Ken 1, asking if he still had a copy of the game. But unfortunately, Ken 1 did not have a copy or a file of the game, and also had no contact with anybody else who worked on it. A couple months later, on September 28, 2021, YouTuber Justin Wang would cover the newly developing story on his Your Lost Media series, a series of videos where people would email Wang into covering their most requested lost media, in order for them to be widely seen and potentially further the chances of them being found. Tusaki was the one who emailed Wang, and at the time it was the biggest exposure the Lost game would ever receive, and exposed many, including myself, to the ongoing search for it. A couple months later, on New Year's Eve of 2021, a longtime Japanese adventure game enthusiast and archivist named Saint uploaded a major find for the Lost Media forum search for Noah's Ark, that being the game's trailer. Saint found the trailer through a demo disc from a 1995 issue of the Japanese gaming magazine Game Blast, which she had actually found a couple months prior in February. This gave the forum an even bigger glimpse of the game, showing off the graphics, gameplay, and most importantly, that awesome theme. But for the next 2 years, there wouldn't be any new developments in the quest to find Noah's Ark, aside from the discovery of another Japanese gaming magazine covering the game, which was found by user Tenacious Nix, with this article of the game also serving as a miniature walkthrough of sorts. And YouTuber Jeremias would do a more in-depth video covering everything I just went over. On October 25th, 2023, in my video on Garage, I lamented on the ongoing search for Noah's Ark at the end, with this video in particular being the biggest exposure that Noah's Ark has ever gotten so far. Though to be clear, my video had nothing to do with the rediscovery of the game, as while I was still hoping for the game's recovery, Saint was still on the search for Noah's Ark, and a year later he and his friend Beanstalk Redump finally found the Lost Ark of Gaming. On November 23rd, 2024, Beanstalk would upload the ISO file of Noah's Ark after winning it from a Japanese auction site. For the first time in 30 years, Noah's Ark could finally be experienced once again. So after all that I just covered, what about the actual game itself? How can you run it today, and would you ever want to in the first place? Before I get into my little review of the game, let's just say that I've had some problems in running it. Like mentioned before, the ISO files that were found can be played in either Windows 3.1 or Mac OS 7. I don't think this goes without saying, but you can't run the game on modern operating systems like Windows 10, so instead you have to rely on a virtual machine or emulator if you want to experience this game. Like Garage Bad Dream Adventure, I first tried running the game in a Windows virtual machine, essentially an emulator for old operating systems. I first tried my build of Windows 98 via PCEM, but when trying to install the game directly from the ISO, it gave me a warning saying I needed a specific DLL file, named winls.dll, which is apparently a file that makes it so that kanji can be properly displayed in the fonts. Once I found this file, I put it in my system folder, where I can finally boot up the installer for Noah's Ark, but as you can see I couldn't get very far because of this screwed up text. When I saw this for the first time, I was kinda creeped out, as if I was accessing a game that was literally made by aliens. It was some real creepypasta shit. Even when I correctly guessed the pathway for how to install the game, when I tried to boot it up, it was still giving me that error when it came to the DLL file, even though I installed it already. I then set up another PC build in PCEM, this time a proper Windows 3.1 build, but since the operating system didn't come with CD-ROM support right out of the box, I had to download the drivers separately, which I failed in doing, and even if I did, I'd probably have the same problems with the DLL file that I had with the Windows 98 build. I decided to give up on PCEM, which is a shame because I really like using it, and instead I turned my sights on other solutions. I found another emulator specifically for Windows 3.1 called WinEVDM, in which you don't need to set up anything, as it's a plug-and-play emulator where all you need to do is drag and drop the compatible executable file into the program. The emulator comes with the DLL file pre-installed, as it's designed to play old Japanese adventure games, but like with PCEM it didn't work. At this point, I thought that all hope was lost, until I remembered that the game was compatible with Mac, specifically Mac OS 7 and 8. I first tried an emulator called Macintosh.js, which just like the last one I went over, is a plug-and-play style virtual machine that is already pre-configured. Unlike my attempts on Windows, my experience on Mac worked on the first try, and I was finally able to experience the world of Noah's Ark. But I still had one problem, and that was the screen size. Macintosh.js emulates the OS in the exact same resolution, 600 by 480, with no way to resize or rescale the image even when in full screen, so I decided to find another Macintosh emulator. On the plus side though, Macintosh.js did come with pre-installed software, including early versions of Photoshop and Premiere, and the shareware version of Duke Nukem 3D, which might just be the worst version of the game I've ever played. Makes World Tour look like a masterpiece. Wait, why do I have all the Steam achievements for World Tour? Was I really that bored? Jeez. Anyways, I tried a different macOS emulator called Basilisk 2, an emulator that's literally older than me, but has been frequently updated in the past 20 years. Though not pre-configured like Macintosh JS, the setup process is incredibly easy, at least compared to setting up a virtual machine in PCEM. So I set up the emulator, booted up the ISO, and bam, I'm finally playing Noah's Ark in full screen, though it looks very blurry because it doesn't upscale the screen properly. So unless you have an old monitor that outputs at 600 by 480, the game just isn't gonna scale the right way. But hey, after all that trouble, I can finally play Noah's Ark in full screen. A game that I can't even play because it's all in Japanese. All the dialogue in the game is presented through voice acting by either audio files or those that are baked into the cutscenes. Unlike many adventure games that had voice acting though, there are no subtitles, meaning that unless somebody wants to re-record the game in English, on top of translating it into English in the first place, it's likely we'll never see a fan translation of this game. Technically though, we can still play the game, I just can't understand the story and will have immense difficulties with the gameplay because of the language barrier. Luckily, if I get lost at all, Saint completed the game on a live stream, which took him about 8 hours to beat, so I'm not completely blind when it comes to experiencing it, and I'm going to be using his gameplay throughout the rest of the video, for a major reason I'll cover in a second. The good news is that he understands a bit of Japanese, so while playing he interjects what the characters are saying, which helped a lot with this video, so if you want to experience the game without playing it, then I highly suggest watching his playthrough. He's specifically playing on a Japanese Windows 95 virtual machine, so it is possible to run it on one, I'm just too stupid to figure it out. Anyways, like stated before, the year is 2100, and just as humans are starting to colonize Mars, a giant alien tower appears, and you as the player are sent to investigate all 7 floors of the tower. You play as this spaceman set to traverse the floors of the tower, and you have a little robot companion on your shoulder, who throughout the game helps you with hints and stuff like that. So after the opening cutscene, you beam near the tower and you're introduced to the gameplay. Your field of view is through this little screen, which is the main reason I played this on Basilisk 2, since the extra screen real estate actually matters. Like many point-and-click adventure games of this era, the scenes where you interact with things are pre-rendered photographs of 3D environments, while the screens where you move from screen to screen are done through cutscenes, which you can actually watch directly via the .mov files of the game. The game looks incredibly dated, and even by 1995, it pales in comparison to everything else that was released at the time in terms of visuals. But like in my Garage Bad Dream Adventure video, it's what gives these games their charm. Anyways, your screen is also occupied by your actions at the bottom, which are search, talk, and analyze. And as you progress through the game, the top of your screen holds the items you find. The end button is how you save and quit the game, and the little box under the main view is used to store these squiggly things, which I think in the game are called spirals, which you get after completing the first 4 floors, and subsequently you use them later on to solve further puzzles on the following ones. If there's any game that Noah's Ark resembles the most, it would definitely be the 1993 game Myst, in both its gameplay and graphics, but Noah's Ark still has its own unique style going on. It's a very trippy and dreamlike game, especially as you get further into it, and it reminds me a lot of the early games of Osamu Sato, in particular Eastern Mind and Shu Tang. Though the game's description and marketing suggest Noah's Ark to be a science fiction based game, in reality that's only a front, as it's mostly focused on fantasy elements, especially in the different settings and characters you encounter. Once you get into the first floor, you are introduced to the magic of the tower, as each floor is kind of like its own infinite planet, or at least that's the best I can describe it. The gameplay and story elements of the tower remind me a lot of the Bruce Lee movie Game of Death, in which Lee's character has to ascend the different floors by defeating these special opponents that occupy each one. The opponents all have different types and styles of fighting, and Lee has to adapt to each one to conquer them, while in Noah's Ark each floor contains different aliens who provide increasingly difficult puzzles to progress further. Each floor also has its own theme going on, which more or less resemble different cultures and locations on Earth, anywhere from ancient Egypt to Stonehenge. The first aliens you encounter in the game are these really strange creatures, but as you ascend the tower, the aliens get a lot less alien-like and start to resemble regular humans. Speaking of the aliens, you can also talk to them by typing in messages, similar to point-and-click adventure games like Starship Titanic. But like in that game, putting in commands to the alien NPCs is required to progress further into the game. And because of the previously mentioned language barrier, I'm unable to put kanji into the text boxes, even if I put the English equivalent, meaning this is as far as I'm gonna get in the game. Again, this is technically doable if you have a Japanese copy of Windows or Mac OS like Saint does, but I don't know how to set those up because of the language barrier, meaning that I can't experience the rest of the game. So that's where my journey ends and where Saints begins. For the first floor, you need to traverse the different islands and find the Ice King's eye, so that he can reunite with the Fire King and combine their powers together. After you do that, you ascend to the second floor, where you start to see more human characters. And when you ask them about info on the tower, they're oblivious to the fact that they're in a tower, believing that they are only on the environments that the different floors are emulating. The game, to my knowledge, doesn't really expand on this much, but my theory is that the different NPCs you encounter throughout the tower were abducted from different parts of the universe such as Earth, kinda like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind with the captured World War II pilots. Anyways, after you solve this puzzle where you put a series of beads in the correct order, you go into this room with this starfish man thing and defeat him with a golden sword. And then you give a golden wheel to this guy, and bam, you collect a yellow spiral and ascend to the third floor, which has more of a forest environment going on. The third floor is probably my favorite of the entire game, mostly because of how trippy and experimental it gets. You go into a building which turns out to be a Japanese school, and when you go into another building, you meet the mayor of this world, who reveals it to be a utopia of sorts where people can relax and have fun. But later, you meet a man made out of wood, who says that the inhabitants are lazy and that their overpopulation is wasting resources. You then get 2 L-shaped Tetris pieces, and use them to open a jail cell where a Catholic nun has been thrown in there, likely because of religious persecution. You also get a gun on this floor, which you use to take down salamanders who shoot fire at you, so this is the closest the game ever comes to being a first-person shooter. If they manage to shoot you before you shoot them, they steal your mushrooms. You also get a futuristic ocarina-like item, and if you use it near this tree, an apple comes out of it. You then take this apple and put it on a fountain, with the water being equivalent to that of liquid heroin, or at least according to the robot. After that, it reveals the nun and mayor, and they help you ascend to the 4th floor as you collect a yellow spiral. The 4th floor has kind of a village theme going on, with a giant hourglass in the middle, and for some reason you go super fast in this world. Each house has a different NPC, and it's revealed that there's a war going on between those who want to destroy the hourglass and those who want to keep it up, with the pro-hourglasses turning themselves into machines to live forever. Inside the hourglass, you solve a variety of puzzles to get into this blue room, with an alien at a control panel, which kinda reminds me of the dog ending in Silent Hill 2. And then you get a brain from a missile, and then you give this brain to this pilot-looking dude. And after that, you access an elevator and you get to the purple spiral and ascend to the 5th floor. This floor has more of a library kind of thing going on, and after you solve some puzzles, you ascend to the 5th floor, where you use the spirals you got in the 1st and 2nd floors to create a new spiral. And then on the 6th floor, you meet the maker of the tower, who reveals that they're creating new life on Mars, and requests humanity to leave because they'll pollute it just like they did with Earth. She ends up transporting you back to the 2nd floor, and after you complete the 2nd floor again, you get transported back to the 6th one. And then once you solve another puzzle, you get transported back to the 3rd floor. And after you complete the 3rd floor again, you get to the 6th, solve another puzzle, get transported to the 4th. I think you get the idea by now. Basically, each puzzle that you solve on the 6th floor, you create a new life form with the newly collected spirals, and you basically need to fail the first 3 times before you birth the correct life form. Anyways, you put your last spirals in the DNA machine, you create a human being looking creature, and finally you talk to the maker of the tower, and she recognizes the strength of humanity, or something like that. Anyways, you get out of the tower, it takes off, and in 50 years a comet comes and makes Mars just like Earth, as the credits roll. Overall, Noah's Ark is okay. It's not one of the worst, nor one of the best of the point-and-click adventure genre. The gameplay is very simple, the puzzles are cryptic, the graphics, though they have their charm, are quite limited, the music is repetitive, and as a whole I found it to be very average. One thing I really like is how trippy the game can get, especially later on. If there's one thing I absolutely love about these old Japanese point-and-click adventure games, it's that sense of surrealism and dreamlike atmosphere that these games capture perfectly. Kazuhiro Nishimatsu's soundtrack is okay, with most of the music heard in the game consisting of atmospheric 10-second loops. The opening theme for the game is great though, definitely the standout of the entire OST. Really, my only gripe with the game is at the very end where you need to play through the previous floors again. It's a terrible way to pad out the game, as when you're sent back to the previous floors there's nothing new about them. The puzzles and what the NPCs say are the exact same thing as when you first entered them. Overall, I think the game is alright, and regardless, I still think it's incredible that we can finally play it today. In closing, though the contents of the game itself may be disappointing, compared to situations like the finding of Garage or the original build of Duke Nukem Forever, it was still incredible to see an entire community come together to find it, as everything, no matter the quality, deserves to be preserved. And though I completely had nothing to do with the actual game's rediscovery, it was a pleasure being part of the ride, and I'd like to shout out Saint, Beanstalk, and everybody else who helped find the game along the way. There's still so much that needs to be found and archived in the world of gaming. Hopefully one day we'll see far more cases of these lost arcs being found.